In the stillness of night, the past speaks softly. Subscribe to hear its voice and never lose your place in its story. You wake before the sun, not because you must, but because in this life, someone always expects you to. You don't belong to yourself anymore. Not really. You belong to the silence before dawn, the scent of jasmine in the hallway, the eyes that might never look your way. You are a royal concubine in ancient Egypt, and your day begins not with affection, but with expectation. No one tells you you're beautiful. They hand you a bronze mirror and let the reflection speak or betray you. Your skin must glow before the Nile glows. Your posture must hold before the courtiers stir. And your eyes, well, they must never reveal the ache of waiting for a man who might never remember your name. You rise from linen sheets that whisper of status but scratch like duty. You're greeted by a servant who tells you look tired, not cruelly, just as a fact. Your future, after all, might hinge on the delicate firmness of your cheekbones. Another woman nearby, pretending to sleep, hears it too. In this quiet battlefield of glances and gestures, everyone is listening. There is no laziness here. The pharaoh may or may not visit, but readiness is not optional. You're not a woman. You are possibility incarnate. A symbol, a whisper of statecraft wrapped in translucent linen. You're guided toward a stretch that has nothing to do with health and everything to do with profile. A bend too deep, a slouch too bold, these are not minor errors. These are career-altering missteps in the silent audition you repeat every single day. You balance a bowl of perfumed water on your head not because it helps, but because it proves something. Your elegance, your endurance, your unspoken desperation not to vanish. Breakfast arrives. One fig, maybe two, a pomegranate seed split like a shared secret. You eat slowly, thoughtfully. The goal is to appear nourished, not needy. Across the room, another woman smiles into her cup, but not with her eyes. The real game begins now. No words, just posture and poise, and 100 ways to say, I am worthy, without ever opening your mouth. A servant recommends a cold compress, which is to say, you look like someone's playing the harp better than you today. You accept the cloth. It smells like lavender and competition. Bathing is next. Not for cleanliness, for transformation. You're not washing the night away. You're washing the village girl out of your memory, scrubbing down to the royal fantasy you are expected to become. The water is scented with lotus and layered with meaning. It's not just about fragrance, it's a ritual. Promise that you will show up again today, even if he doesn't. Attendants scrub you with natron, a gritty powder older than the pyramids themselves. Stings, but you pretend not to notice. Nobility doesn't wince. Nobility exfoliates. Then comes the hair removal. Every strand below the eyebrow is considered betrayal. Wax, blades, tweezers, it doesn't matter. The pain is part of the script. You bite down on your pride and let it burn. And then the oiling. Thick, golden, almond sweet, poured by someone who whispers flattery the way a priest might deliver a prayer. You're rubbed until your skin shines like a temple wall. You nearly slip standing up because you are now, quite literally, a candle lit from within. The perfume comes in layers, like the hopes pinned to your back. A musky base, confidence. A citrus middle, freshness. A floral top, illusion. You smell divine. You are divine. You must be. Finally, you're draped in sheer linen, the color of moonlight. It clings in all the right places. You're told to sit still for an hour so the oils may settle. But really, it's just another test. Can you sit, radiant and composed, without fidgeting, without folding? Can you hold beauty like it's effortless? You haven't left the room. You haven't seen the pharaoh. But already you've endured more than most. You've waged a war of stillness, of softness, of silent strength. And tomorrow you'll do it all again. You don't just rise clean, you rise transformed. Not because you were ever unworthy, but because the morning expects proof of your perfection. Your body has been baptized in petals and polished with care, and now the second act begins. The delicate construction of a divine illusion. Forget inner radiance. Today's survival depends on the sharpness of your eyeliner and the quiet perfection of your cheekbones. You sit before a bronze mirror so polished it feels less like a reflection and more like a prophecy. Behind you, the cosmetics girl arrives, carrying a wooden tray filled with powders and pastes. Crushed galena for the eyes, red ochre for the cheeks, carmine from beetles for the lips. These aren't just tools. They're war paints for a battle fought in silence. The coal comes first, ground into a deep black paste. It's applied with a reed so precise it could be used to draft royal decrees. The line must glide, not tremble. Too bold and you look theatrical. Too faint and you're invisible. It's a balance between allure and authority, and you hold your breath as it's drawn, one stroke at a time, like a prayer whispered on the edge of ambition. You're told to be still, which is difficult when someone is prodding your eyelid with the delicacy of a falcon's talon. One misplaced tear and the whole masterpiece blurs. A smudge could mean the difference between invitation and invisibility. The stakes? Eternal linen-folding duty with no audience but the mice. Next, your lips. A mixture of red ochre and animal fat is dabbed on with precision. There's something oddly intimate about it, like being kissed by a memory of something forbidden. Your lips must say everything without speaking. Inviting yet modest. Bold yet unthreatening. You wear your silence like a veil. Then the blush, just a soft sweep across the cheeks to hint at youth. Even though you haven't known real rest since the last inundation of the Nile, you paint vitality over exhaustion. No one must know you're tired. Tired women vanish. A girl steps forward, no older than 15, holding an ivory comb for your brows. She shapes them as if aligning stars in a constellation only the court understands. Dignity, fertility, subtle power. No one truly agrees on what the brows symbolize anymore, but their symmetry must whisper something important. Finally, scent returns. Not the bath perfume, but a new layer, placed behind the ears and on the wrists. These are strategic locations, where the pulse lives, where a king might pause in thought, where fate might brush its fingers across your skin and say, "This one." You examine yourself once more. You no longer look like a woman. You look like a legend painted onto a tomb wall, offering lotus blossoms to a god who may or may not be listening. You're radiant, or at least they say you are. Not quite as radiant as yesterday, of course, but close enough to be noticed. Then comes breakfast, though the term hardly applies. In the dining chamber, a room designed more for spectacle than satiety. Women gather in translucent linen that says everything without speaking. No one rushes. No one slouches. The air smells faintly of honey and silent envy. Your plate arrives. 2 figs, a cluster of dates, and a smudge of yogurt. It's not about nourishment. It's about balance. Enough sweetness to energize your gaze. Enough discipline to keep your waistline holy. You eat with 3 fingers, slowly, letting the fruit linger as if every bite is an act of poetry. Women who finish too fast are suspect. Women who don't eat at all are suspicious. Across the table, someone leans in, voice dripping in syrup. "Your coal is daring today," she says with a half smile. You nod, thanking her as you mentally note the uneven arch of her brow. Another concubine, young and eager, sits beside you and loudly mentions she stayed up rehearsing harp melodies, just in case His Majesty feels musical tonight. You smile. The war of implication has begun. You take a slow bite. Let a fig seed rest on your lip like punctuation. Around you, conversation spirals. Gossip cloaked in sweetness. Who cried at bathing? Who dared to borrow perfume uninvited? Who was seen exiting the astrologer's room looking far too hopeful? Everyone is pretending not to care, but of course they all do. Servants move with precision, refilling goblets with palm wine, just enough for ritual, never for indulgence. A sip too many and someone might say something they can't unsay, and in this place, stories travel faster than truth. You end the meal with a ceremonial brushing of your teeth, using a split twig dipped in natron. Tastes like salt and survival. You smile into the bronze once more. Another performance complete. Another battle won with grace and restraint. And while you might wish for a moment of peace, to lie beneath a tree or touch the Nile's edge, you're ushered instead into the next arena. It's called the relaxation gallery. But make no mistake, this is no sanctuary. This is the runway of rest. A curated scene where you must exude serenity without laziness, elegance without effort. You are not merely present. You are presenting. You've entered the most exhausting part of your day. The art of existing beautifully with no script, no cue. Only the knowledge that someone important might glance your way and decide your fate in a single blink. You settle among 24 others, reclining not in rest but in ritual. The embroidered cushions beneath you aren't for comfort, they're stages for performance. Every angle of your body must suggest nobility. Every tilt of the chin must whisper fertility. And your eyes? They should say nothing at all while implying everything. Here, even boredom is choreographed to appear elegant. You're allowed to pass the time, but only with activities considered properly ornamental. Reading aloud might raise eyebrows, it implies too much thought. But plucking a harp string with studied grace? That's ideal. Smelling flowers while gazing wistfully into the middle distance is highly recommended. It communicates divine serenity, lightly seasoned with availability. If you're feeling bold, you might attempt what the seasoned call accidental elegance. A sandal falls off just so. A thoughtful sigh escapes as you stretch, subtle hints that you have inner depths, but no agenda. These are not accidents. These are rehearsed flourishes, performed as if they weren't. Meanwhile, the younger girls miss the memo and dive headfirst into dramatics. Posing like temple statues mid-exorcism, their longing for attention louder than a cymbal clash. You, however, are smarter than that. You've learned that success lies not in the effort, but in hiding the effort. You're a vision draped in linen, a moving fresco. When a scribe passes by, you don't look, but you shift just slightly enough to catch the light. Enough to become a silhouette someone might mention later with curiosity. And if, by word or whim, the pharaoh hears that the third woman from the left possessed an unusual air of mystique today, that's not coincidence. That's strategy disguised as stillness. You've just completed 2 hours of exquisite non-activity. And in this world, that's not laziness. That's high art. Eventually, the lounging ends. Not because you're tired, though you are, but because it's time for your daily instruction. A form of education, though not the kind that awards scrolls or unlocks futures. This is training with one purpose: to make you unforgettable for 6 minutes without threatening anyone's sense of control. You move into a bright chamber where instructors wait, their robes simple but authoritative. Wax tablets in hand, they begin the day's lessons. Harp tuning, poetic recitation, and the all-important art of gazing upward while speaking of dreams. Music holds the most weight. A concubine who can coax emotion from a harp string has the power to shift alliances with a melody. You're taught ancient love songs. Every verse is a bouquet of papyrus metaphors and fruit-flavored flattery. Your eyes intoxicate like wine, my heart blossoms at your name. You try to sing it like you mean it, adding a practiced tilt of the shoulder, a flutter of the wrist. Performance is persuasion. Next is poetry, not composing, of course. That's too daring. You recite lines with emotional control. The moon weeps for my loneliness. You whisper, pretending not to giggle even though you suspect the moon is far too busy commanding tides to worry about your love life. Sometimes they allow a touch of literacy, just enough to scrawl royal compliments in hieroglyphs. Pharaoh shines like the midday sun, or I dreamed of lotus blossoms, are considered appropriate. Anything more complex might raise suspicion. Knowledge is powerful, but too much of it in a woman, dangerous. Then comes mythology, not for belief but for flattery. You learn which god to compare the pharaoh to: Ra for power, Thoth for wisdom, Anubis for strength. Choose wrong, and you become the girl who accidentally likened the ruler to a jackal. That mistake becomes legend. Your grasp of these lessons is tested, but never directly. Instead, an instructor might lean in and ask, "Which deity does the king bring to mind?" You know the answer. Whichever one he embodies today. That's the correct reply. Not honest, just useful. Your training won't prepare you for the world beyond these walls. But if one day the pharaoh requests a verse, a melody, or a whispered devotion, you'll be ready. Or at least you'll know how to look ready. Now that you've practiced enough courtly size to rival a sculpture with feelings, it's time for refinement drills, the daily discipline of becoming an artwork in motion. It begins, humbly enough, with walking. Yes, walking. You'd think you mastered that somewhere around toddlerhood. But here, movement isn't about getting from one place to another, it's about gliding, floating, appearing so effortless that effort disappears. Of course, your sandals have no grip, the floors are polished to mirror shine, and someone is always secretly praying for you to trip. Not out of cruelty, well, not just cruelty, but because every fall adjusts the hierarchy. To train, they place a clay jug of water atop your head and ask you to walk a corridor. One slow, balanced step after another. You don't spill, you don't wobble, and most of all, you don't reveal the burning tension in your spine. This isn't just posture. This is power disguised as poise. You make it, somehow, and just as your muscles begin to sigh in relief, you're told it's time for the next lesson. Dance. Because in this world, even joy is studied. Let me know when you're ready for the next passage. I'll continue weaving it with the same tone, authenticity, and immersive style, balancing history with drama and mystery with humanity. You stand in a line, barefoot and glistening, among women who know how to move like poetry written in silence. The lesson today? Grace under pressure, literally. You're taught to sway like reeds in a Nile breeze. Soft, hypnotic, and just restrained enough to remain respectable. Hips fluid, but dignified. Arms lifted, but with intention. It's not a dance. It's a declaration whispered through motion. You try to follow the rhythm, even as your right foot begins plotting its own revolution. An instructor walks by, narrowing their eyes. Too stiff, they mutter. Another adds, your timing is cautious. You nod graciously, all while quietly imagining stabbing your own reflection with a decorative hairpin. But of course you smile. Always smile. Next comes the lesson in gestures. You're reminded, concubines do not point. They extend. They don't wave. They present. Movements must float, never flick. Every flicker of a wrist or flutter of a hand must seem effortless, even if your shoulder's gone numb and the floral oil is beginning to fade. Then kneeling practice, yes, kneeling, but not just any kneel. You're trained to descend in reverence without desperation, because one wrong eyebrow angle could suggest ambition, and ambition is dangerous. Finally, voice drills. You rehearse the phrase, my lord, in 20 shades of emotion. Each version a subtle performance, from humbled admiration to gentle disdain masked as submission. By the end of it, you're sore, glistening, and spiritually bruised. But you glide better, and in this palace, elegance is a form of currency. You've earned your keep for now. Once your regiment of balancing, gesturing, and sighing concludes, you're returned to the common rooms, a space that pretends to be restful but hums with the tension of silent wars. Women lounge on cushions arranged like chess pieces. Here, every glance carries weight. Eye contact is a weapon. Seating order is strategy. Gossip is the undercurrent that drives this river. It's not petty, it's essential. Information, after all, is power. Some concubines climb through charm, others through skill. But the truly dangerous ones, they know everything before it happens. You sit beside a group threading beads with hands as graceful as their tongues are sharp. It starts innocently enough. A tale about a servant who dropped a bowl near a court scribe. But soon, the conversation shifts into something richer. Who received new bangles? Who emerged from the astrologer's chambers with blotchy cheeks? And who hasn't said a word since the last sandal fitting? Names are rarely spoken aloud. Only hints. The one with too much cinnamon oil. You know, the girl who always looks like she's suppressing a sneeze. Nods follow. Everyone understands. The senior concubines don't say much. They observe. Because true power doesn't speak, it gathers. Those who understand this have a quiet edge. Knowing that the pharaoh prefers honeyed wine to date wine, that's leverage. Knowing which temple priest his mother distrusts, that's protection. You join the exchange cautiously. A single clever comment could make you relevant. One careless word, and you're folding linens for eternity. Some women keep wax tablets, coded, of course. Not diaries, but records. Tactical notes disguised as daydreams. Observations on who coughed during a harp solo, who arrived late to prayer, who rearranged the flowers near the sacred cat statue without permission. It's all currency. And if two women tell you the same secret from opposite sides, that's not coincidence. That's your invitation to the real game. And you never speak of the pharaoh. Not directly. That would be suicide. But the concubines? They're fair game. In fact, it's expected. You're not just gossiping. You're gathering data, playing your part in a palace system built on whispers and beauty. By the time you leave the room, you've collected more insight than any official lesson ever offered. And you've made eye contact with 3 potential rivals. Well done. Now comes the most bittersweet ritual of your day. The long, aching stillness of hope. The possibility, however slim, that the pharaoh might summon you. You know he likely won't. He's probably overseeing canal projects or listening to court musicians with names longer than their melodies. But that doesn't matter. Your job is to be ready just in case. You're escorted to the waiting chamber. Gilded columns, incense smoke curling like secret prayers, and cushions that suggest relaxation but demand alertness. Everyone arranges themselves in the same 3 perfected poses. Demure but intriguing, relaxed but luminous, utterly indifferent, but not too indifferent. You choose a spot near the window. Natural light glides across your cheekbones. Not that you've practiced this. Not that you angled your face exactly 20 degrees to the left. A servant enters. Heads rise, not fully, just a flicker. Is she here for someone? Is it you? No. She's refilling fruit. Still, the moment pulses. You glance down at your grapes. Were they arranged regally enough? You shift slightly, not for comfort, but for symmetry. Every 15 minutes, you move not because you're restless, but because statues don't get chosen. Women do. And so you sit, glowing softly in the half-light, caught between stillness and suspense, holding space for a door that may never open. But if it does, you'll be ready. You sit so still, your limbs almost forget they exist. But not quite. They must remain pliable, prepared to spring into grace at any moment. Because if your name is called, you're expected to rise like a breeze off the Nile, not like a woman who's been balancing between hope and cramps for 3 hours. You even rehearse your face, surprised but grateful, not too eager, not too stunned. Just enough emotion to say, "Oh, me?" without crying or fainting. Some girls hum to themselves. Others whisper poetry they've written in secret, their voices a quiet rebellion against invisibility. One nearby plucks her lute with the somber dedication of someone serenading fate itself. You sip your wine, face neutral, while mentally rewriting her lyrics into something that actually rhymes. Time stretches, curtain stirs. Somewhere in the distance, the distinct slap of a sandal echoes against stone. The air freezes. Was that someone coming? You hold your breath, until you realize it's just a servant heading toward the latrine. You exhale in unison with the others, graciously, like it doesn't matter. But deep inside, your soul lets out a silent scream into the void. Eventually, a name is spoken, not yours. The chosen girl glides past, barefoot and blooming in rose oil. She doesn't smile, she glows. Everyone offers polite nods, teeth clenched in harmony. You remain, a statue of restraint wrapped in linen, your arms aching, your heart pretending not to care. He didn't call you tonight, but maybe tomorrow. You remind yourself again to stay ready, because in this palace, anticipation is its own performance. If the royal harem were a garden, it wouldn't be a tranquil pond with drifting lotus petals. It would be a hedge maze, perfectly trimmed, impeccably arranged, and filled with velvet-clad predators who smile while sharpening their claws. Everyone here is beautiful. That was the admission price. But beauty alone isn't enough. Influence, loyalty, and strategy are the real game. You learn quickly that the most powerful tool here isn't your appearance. It's your ability to deliver a compliment that feels like a dagger dipped in honey. You're glowing today. One girl purrs, meaning, your neck looks sunburnt. Alliances form like constellations, usually circling the one who had a confirmed audience with the pharaoh most recently. These cliques aren't just friendships. They're social fortresses, half support network, half surveillance squad. Getting accepted into one is like marrying into a royal household. You gain protection, whispers of status, and a permanent mark of suspicion. You, however, are a floater, one of the quiet ones. You smile at everyone and trust no one. You listen more than you speak. You compliment more than you confess. And you always pretend not to hear what you absolutely heard. Smiling becomes your armor. You perfect its many forms. The warm smile, the reassuring smile, the not-so-subtle smile that says, "Thank you for that irrelevant opinion." You rotate through them like a queen spinning prayer beads. The older concubines have refined the art of silent warfare. They don't attack, they praise. But they do it with such surgical precision that entire reputations wilt. Of course she was summoned. The pharaoh always did favor nurturing types. One murmurs. No insult. Just a nudge. Just enough to collapse someone's self-worth before the figs are served. Sometimes, a new girl tries sincerity. She opens her heart, asks questions, shares memories. The next morning, she's emotionally deflated before her first figure. Lesson learned. In the palace, vulnerability isn't charming. It's an invitation for strategic sabotage. You discover that neutrality is harder than loyalty. Compliment one girl too often, and you're her lapdog. Compliment two, and you're a traitor. Compliment none, and you're labeled aloof. The safest to admire the cat. The cat doesn't talk, and so you smile, because smiling hides the truth. It stretches time, keeps you on the board, even if you're just another pawn hoping to be promoted. But then, the air shifts. A presence enters that changes everything. The great royal wife. Her title alone silences the room. Her jewelry arrives before she does, sometimes literally. She rarely visits. She doesn't need to. Her influence is stitched into the silk of the curtains, into the golden edges of every cushion. But when she does arrive, she doesn't walk in. She arrives like a breeze laced with thunder. You don't hear her footsteps. You feel them. A pressure in the atmosphere. A hush that pulls attention like gravity. Voices evaporate. Figs are frozen midair. Ankles cross in unison. Postures reset. And suddenly, everyone is deeply engrossed in studying the veins of a nearby plant. She appears, older than most of you, wiser than all of you, her eyeliner darker, her headdress taller, her gaze slower and far more dangerous. She walks like a woman who's been watching hopeful girls come and go since the floodplain first dried. Every look is a message, every silence a warning. She doesn't need to raise her voice. She doesn't even need to speak. But when she does, it's something artfully vague like, "I trust the younger ladies are making wise choices." No names, no accusations, just enough ambiguity to send emotional tremors through 3 different corners of the room. You offer your most flawless smile, the one reserved for women who can have you reassigned to polishing ceremonial fans if your posture displeases them. You hold it just long enough to feel your cheekbones quiver, and still you remain graceful. Because in the kingdom behind the throne, survival isn't about brute strength or wit. It's about smiling softly as the storm walks by. You keep your posture perfect, even as your legs threaten to fall asleep. Comfort, after all, is not the goal here, readiness is. At any moment, you may be summoned, and you must rise like silver mist, not like someone whose limbs have been folded into statues all afternoon. You even rehearse your face for that moment. A touch of surprise, followed by graceful delight. Not too thrilled, not too indifferent, just enough to look effortless. Around you, the women engage in gentle distractions. Some hum lullabies to themselves. Others murmur verses they've penned in secret. Brave little spells of longing no one will admit they've heard. One girl strums her lute so delicately it sounds like she's courting destiny. You sip your wine and politely avoid critique. Out loud. Anyway, in your mind, you rewrite half her melody. Time drifts. Curtains rustle. A sandal taps in the corridor. All breath halts. Maybe this time. You lean forward slightly, then pause. Just a servant. just the latrine. You nod, exhale with grace, while your inner hope collapses into a silent scream. Finally, a servant appears again, and this time a name is spoken, quietly, reverently, like a blessing from the gods. It's not yours. You smile. You always smile. You nod supportively toward the chosen one as she glides away, eyes low, radiating rose oil and triumph. Your jewelry stays where it is. Your limbs remain in place, but a tiny part of you, the secret part, folds in on itself. Still, you keep your mask intact, because he may not have summoned you today, but tomorrow exists, and in this place, tomorrow is always the strongest illusion of all. If the harem were a garden, it wouldn't be a tranquil haven of lotus flowers and quiet koi. No, it would be a sculpted maze with perfumed predators. A space where every smile hides a calculation. Everyone here is radiant. That's the entrance requirement. The real currency lies in connections, timing, and the art of saying you're stunning, while mentally rearranging your rival's seating chart. Some form alliances that orbit around recent favor, cliques built like miniature empires, each with its own rules, spies, and ranking systems. Entering one of these groups feels like stepping into royalty. You gain protection, but also eternal suspicion. You, however, choose another path, the quiet one. You become a diplomat of smiles, friendly to all, loyal to none. You master your expressions. The warm smile of approval, the grateful smile of survival, the subtle smile that says, "I'm listening but judging." You rotate through them like a seasoned performer. The senior women have long since graduated from open conflict. They fight in shadows now, through veiled compliments and casual remarks engineered to wound. Of course she was summoned. The pharaoh has always favored nurturing energy. No insult, just suggestion. Enough to ruin someone's night while keeping your hands clean. Occasionally, a new girl stumbles in with open-hearted honesty. She shares her story. She asks for advice. And by morning, she's emotionally shredded, her name a whisper behind veils. Lesson learned. Vulnerability here is not charming. It's chum in crocodile waters. So you stay neutral. Compliment one too often, you become her servant. Compliment two, you're a traitor. Compliment none, you're a threat. Best to praise the palace cat. The cat keeps secrets, and still you smile, because smiling buys time. Smiling keeps the game going. Smiling convinces them, and maybe you, that you still have a chance. But then it happens. The energy shifts again. The great royal wife enters. You don't hear her. You feel her. Like the first gust of desert wind before a storm, she carries the room into stillness. Her visits are rare, and all the more powerful for it. When she walks in, even the scent of the air seems to pause. Conversations fade to whispers, movements slow, and suddenly, every woman in the room is fascinated by a nearby curtain tassel. She moves like someone born from incense and firelight, older, wiser, untouched by desperation. Her eyeliner is darker, her silence deeper, her gaze surgical. She doesn't speak, not at first. She simply looks, one by one. A flicker of recognition here, a flash of memory there. She sees you, and she nods. It's not approval, it's acknowledgement. For today, you are beneath her notice. And in this world, that's a victory. Around her, younger women try to win her favor. They tilt vases, quote myths, offer compliments so reverent they almost sound sincere. She accepts these offerings with a faint smile. But you know she's seen it all. Once she was you, but she outplayed the game. She rose, not through beauty, but through flawless timing and quiet ruthlessness. Then, as if swept away by some unseen current, she glides from the room, her golden silks trailing behind like a comet's breath. For a moment, no one moves, not even the air. And then slowly, like light returning after an eclipse, conversation resumes. Quieter now, more deliberate. The queen has reminded everyone. In this place, real power does not shout. It whispers and is obeyed. The sun disappears behind the palace walls, casting its final light across the Nile. Evening settles. The atmosphere shifts again. Nervous fingers rebraid hair, Perfume is reapplied, linens retied, because dusk brings with it the most dangerous of emotions. Hope. You've spent the entire day performing perfection, and now you wait again, but this time it's different. This isn't about poise. This is about possibility. Maybe tonight, maybe the pharaoh will call. The younger girls keep their voices soft, practicing love songs or murmuring of prophetic dreams, visions of royal snakes and wedding ceremonies. The older women sip quietly, their eyes unreadable. They've played this hand too many times to show excitement now. You sit calmly, wearing your best vague smile, the one that says, "I'm serene," while inside your mind is rehearsing your graceful rise. You're whispered, "My king." A servant enters. The tension is a living thing now. She clears her throat. Then the name. It is not yours. You nod, composed. You smile at the chosen girl, who walks like the moonlight loves her. You raise your cup, but the wine tastes of nothing now. You remove your earrings in silence. You wipe away your painted face, not with sorrow, but with ritual. You bathe once more, not to cleanse the body, but to wash off expectation. You slip into your nightdress and curl onto your mat. Above you, the moon watches, unblinking. From the upper chambers, distant music drips like honey. You whisper to yourself, "Maybe tomorrow." That hope is why you stay, not for certainty, but for the illusion of it. And illusions are powerful things. As the palace quiets and the lamps burn low, the harem shifts into its most mysterious state, dream hour. This is the realm where fantasy walks free and reality politely excuses itself. You lie still, staring at the ceiling, the linen above you fluttering like a gentle ghost. Around you, women whisper dreams like their spells. One murmurs of walking on water lilies. Another swears she saw the pharaoh with a lion's head. Someone claims a raven spoke her name in riddles. And in this strange world, dreams matter. Dreams are doors. Dreams are leverage. Dreams, when timed well, can change everything. You keep your own scroll beneath your mat, a cracked sheet of papyrus with your nightly visions inked in quiet desperation. Courtyard flooded, possible sign of emotional turmoil. Pharaoh smiled, turned into a fish, unclear. You hope one day a priest with a taste for metaphors might read them and see you not as a concubine, but as a mystic. Some dreams are shared with purpose. A girl recently claimed the queen offered her lotus blossoms in sleep. Now she's been invited to embroidery circle. No one believes her, but everyone knows. Believable lies are currency. You dream, too, of rising, of owning land, of whispering counsel the pharaoh actually heeds. Sometimes you dream of leaving, but then you remember what lies beyond these walls. Fields, sunburn, and husbands who never stop chewing. Here, at least, ambition is still dressed in silk. You whisper your latest dream to the girl beside you. A cat walked backward and gave you a crown. She nods. "Definitely Batet," she says. "Power is coming," you both agree. Because in this place, even false hope is better than none at all. And by your 14th bath and 29th fig, you begin to wonder, what exactly is freedom? You sometimes hear it late at night, murmured softly between sips of too warm wine. A single word, spoken like a forbidden spell. Freedom. The older women say it not often and never loudly, just quietly, while staring out past the courtyard walls, as if their minds could still travel where their bodies no longer can. "I remember walking to the market," one whispers. "Once, I chose my own hairstyle," says another. You nod respectfully, trying to picture a life where the most urgent decision wasn't whether to wear jasmine or sandalwood oil for evening placement. By appearance alone, your life is pure luxury. Silks that flow like water, music that never stops, meals that arrive without effort. You don't chase goats anymore. You don't sleep on straw. But behind the woven screens and gold leaf walls, your choices are fewer than a basket of dried lentils. You want to leave the palace? Adorable. You belong to it now. Technically, you're not a prisoner. But try stepping past those guards with your eyeliner slightly smudged, and you'll be reminded how very optional freedom is for women who belong to kings. Want to marry? Only if you're forgotten long enough for someone to release you, an act that feels less like rejection and more like a rare form of release. Want to raise your voice? Only in song or prayer, and only if it's soft enough not to echo. Your thoughts are lovely but impractical, like the beaded bracelets on your wrist, eye-catching but not designed to be useful. And yet, within this finely woven cage, some women find a different kind of freedom. Not the physical kind, that's laughable, but the type of influence that floats beneath the surface. The ability to recommend a poem at court, to nudge a priest into prominence, to suggest, with just a glance, that the royal chef might consider honey-glazed duck next week. Does not rule, it's ripple, but sometimes ripples shift the entire current. You remember the girl you used to be, dust on your knees, the sun in your hair, chasing animals and possibilities. That girl was free in the open-air sense. You're free in the knows how to shift noble loyalties without speaking sense. Is that better? You don't know. But you do know this. In this palace, freedom isn't granted. It's performed. The better you perform, the fewer people question whether you're free at all. And one day, this performance will end. You won't be summoned anymore. Maybe a younger girl will replace you. One with tighter skin and a more practiced smile. Maybe the pharaoh will abandon the harem for falconry and a life of talking to birds. Or maybe, without ceremony, you'll be reassigned to a countryside villa. There to sip watered wine and remember the night you almost got called, but didn't, because someone's cousin had a migraine. And then comes the quieter thought, the one you try not to say aloud. Will anyone remember you? No statues will bear your likeness. Those are for kings, gods, and men who invented new irrigation systems. Your name might appear in a ledger, row 34, request for extra scented oil. Maybe your name's misspelled. Maybe it's just labeled unknown. Unless you die young and tragically, near a fountain or under a sacred tree, no one will carve songs in your memory. And even then, the verses may be reassigned to someone more politically convenient. Still, you hope. You hope the queen will remember your steady hands during dress fittings. That a younger girl might mimic your posture one day, not realizing it's a tribute. You hope a servant says, "She once made the pharaoh laugh," and means it. Maybe that's legacy, not permanence, just pieces of memory, drifting like pollen through someone else's afternoon. And on certain nights, when the wind smells like crushed myrrh and the moonlight catches the stones just right, you let yourself imagine more. Maybe, just maybe, your name ends up in a scroll. Maybe a scholar finds it centuries later. Maybe they misread it, theorize about it, turn you into a question mark behind glass. Still, it's something, because you were here. You outlasted rivals. You mastered stillness, survival, and diplomacy disguised as deference. You turned obedience into performance. You made patience look like strategy. You lived in the palace of kings, even if none of it ever belonged to you. And in a world where most women never made it past the edge of the village, you became a whisper that lingers in the marble halls. It may not be immortality, but it's close enough. And just when you begin to drift into that warm space between reflection and sleep, the past slips away, and the story shifts. The lamps dim, the feast fades, the nobles retreat to their chambers, full of wine and empty ceremony. But for the newlyweds, the night is just beginning. Not in the way of poetry and love, but in spectacle. Because in the medieval world, a wedding wasn't sealed with a kiss. It was sealed with witnesses, and linen, and the unsettling presence of extended family. The bedding ceremony, less of a romantic ritual and more of a communal inspection, wasn't just about intimacy. It was about proof. Proof of heirs. Proof of alliances. Proof that what had been arranged had now been completed. As the sun vanished, so did privacy, and the bedroom became a courtroom. You're no longer in Egypt. You're standing just outside a medieval chamber door, where whispers grow louder and the real story is just beginning. You might think, after the feasting and toasting, after the last slice of roast boar and the final song fading into the rafters, that the newlyweds would be granted a moment of quiet, a breath of privacy, a soft closing of a door. But no. If you were fortunate, the crowd would simply help you out of your shoes, raise a goblet one last time, sing something vaguely inappropriate, and then let the door close behind you. If you were less fortunate, they'd stay. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make sure everything that was supposed to happen did. They might wait long enough to see you disrobed. They might hover to inspect the linens. They might shout encouragement or advice, as if intimacy were a wrestling match and honor was the prize. And in many noble households, a bishop, a midwife, or an elderly aunt was assigned the peculiar task of confirming that the bed told the right story by morning. Why the theater? Because in medieval Europe, marriage wasn't a private vow. It was a public transaction. A noblewoman's virginity wasn't personal. It was political currency. A nobleman's ability to consummate the union wasn't just expected. It was required. If no one could swear it had happened, it could be declared void. And with it, any alliances, land rights, or inheritance claims would dissolve like mist. It didn't matter if the bride trembled with fear or the groom reeked of wine or if neither knew the other's middle name. What mattered was verification. Someone had to say they saw or heard the beginning of their union. If they didn't, it might not count. The most private part of a marriage began with an audience and ended with evidence. Once the final toast was raised, the bedding procession began. And no, this wasn't a quiet stroll lit by candlelight and well wishes. It was a parade. Loud, lewd, joyous, unforgiving. The groom was often red-faced from either wine or nerves, half dragged and half cheered into the bedchamber by a horde of chanting friends. Meanwhile, the bride, pale, often silent, was flanked by her female relatives, whose duty it was to escort her with decorum, and to ensure, should the need arise, that she did not make a run for it. For noble women, this was more than ceremony. It was their unveiling as property. For peasant girls, it was still a public ritual, a staged display of modesty and submission. But for all brides, rich or poor, it was theater. And the music. Oh yes, there was music. Not soft lutes or romantic ballads. Think drums, flutes, and songs shouted with purpose, songs designed to mock, to entertain, and to pressure. In parts of France, this raucous tradition had a name: the chivalry, a ritualized cacophony meant to encourage successful consummation through embarrassment. Hazing, medieval style, often with a hymn or two tacked on for good measure. Once at the chamber, the disrobing began. Not private, not delicate. The groom was often undressed by his friends, the bride by her maids or older relatives. Every garment peeled away wasn't just fabric. It was symbolism, the shedding of childhood, the stripping of independence. You were no longer your own. You now belonged to someone else, or more accurately, to the bond between two families. In some regions, a priest would bless the marriage bed, as if divine approval could soften what was about to unfold. In others, wine or spiced milk was shared between the couple, a final comfort before expectation replaced celebration. But the onlookers, they didn't always leave. Some waited just outside the door, ears pressed to wooden panels. Others stood behind a curtain, or in dim corners, tasked with witnessing. Not romance, but evidence. And this wasn't unusual. In many medieval communities, privacy on the wedding night simply wasn't a concept, because this wasn't about love. It was about proof. And that proof could be visual, auditory, or tactile. In some traditions, once the couple had finished, a stained bedsheet was displayed the next morning as evidence of virginity and legitimacy. If the sheet was clean, it was a problem. If the bride had a reputation or simply bad luck, her honor could be publicly challenged. And if the groom was unable or unwilling to perform, the consequences ranged from scandal to annulment. Not all weddings were this invasive. In some places, elders simply escorted the couple, removed a shoe, offered a blessing, and exited gracefully. Symbolism was enough. But in the higher courts, especially where titles and territories were at stake, the line between custom and surveillance blurred. Some families appointed official witnesses who signed documents attesting to consummation. These weren't just tipsy relatives, they were legal scribes of the marital night. Because in a world where power flowed through bloodlines, there could be no ambiguity. If it wasn't seen, it wasn't real. If it wasn't heard, it didn't happen. And yes, it gets more disturbing. Historical records speak of ceremonies where onlookers monitored for movement beneath the sheets, where they listened for specific sounds, where they returned the next morning to verify physical signs, especially the presence of blood. If there wasn't any, questions arose. If rumors spread, marriages crumbled. And if the bride was thought to be less than pure, the scrutiny doubled. Her word meant nothing. Only the linen could speak for her. You step into the chamber, not hand in hand with your beloved, but under the watchful weight of generations. The door may close, the guests may retreat, some reluctantly, others with a final toast or a bawdy blessing. But privacy is only an illusion. The real ceremony begins now, and calling it romantic would be a lie even the candles couldn't tell. If you're the bride, dread has been sitting in your chest all day like a stone. If you're the groom, the weight is different, but no lighter. Your performance is not simply expected, it is demanded. And not just for love, but for law. Nobility turns intimacy into spectacle, and the bed becomes evidence. This isn't about desire, it's about duty. For noble couples, this first night might be the first moment alone together, and yet it feels anything but private. If the act doesn't happen, or worse, fails to convince, the fallout won't be whispered. It will be recorded, litigated, weaponized. Lawsuits, church investigations, and family disgrace were all on the table. The couple, lying in a carved wooden bed beneath the gaze of painted saints and pomegranate motifs, are meant to complete what the procession began. But how do you even breathe, let alone connect, when you know a chorus of family expectations hums just outside the door? In lower households, the ceremony might be simpler. Some crude jokes, a toast, maybe a cousin tapping on the wall for good luck. But in noble circles, where titles and dowries hinged on heirs, failure to consummate publicly or believably could collapse an entire dynastic plan. So here you are, two strangers, sometimes barely adults, facing each other like actors handed a script with no rehearsal. Consent? Technically assumed, practically ignored. The bride was often raised to be quiet, compliant, taught that her modesty was her virtue. The groom was expected to assert, to act, to prove. In a room full of symbols, flickering candles, fertility carvings, even icons nailed to the headboard, you were expected to carry out your part under the crushing gravity of performance. For some, it went smoothly, or as smoothly as anything could in a room still buzzing from laughter and pressure. For others, it was a disaster. The groom might drink too much, freeze, or fall apart. The bride might tremble, retreat, or weep. And if the act didn't happen, or worse, didn't leave evidence, it wasn't just personal. It was political failure. Kings, dukes, and barons alike have found themselves mocked, disgraced, even dethroned over an unsuccessful wedding night. It became fodder for gossip, cannon fire for enemies, and justification for annulment. And all of it, every rumor, every accusation, often came down to a single object. The sheet. Come morning, the whispers begin again. Not just birdsong and breakfast trays, but footsteps of expectation. In many noble households, the bedclothes were treated as legal proof. Someone would be sent to inspect them. A midwife, a chambermaid, or worse, a high-ranking relative with a practiced eye. They'd search for a stain, a spot of blood, a sign that the bride had done her duty and the union was complete. If the mark was there, congratulations. If not, the air changed. Silence turned suspicious, and the bride's virtue, once presumed, was now on trial. Let's pause here. We now know that virginity is not reliably proven by blood. It never was. But medieval fathers-in-law, armed with legal scrolls and family pride, weren't interested in nuance. No stain, no proof. No proof, no inheritance. Suddenly, your womb, your blood, your body became the foundation for political legitimacy. If the sheet didn't cooperate, consequences followed. Accusations, public shaming, whispered questions about deceit, sometimes annulments. And while the pressure affected both spouses, it was the bride who bore the brunt. Because in this system, if something went wrong, the woman must have done it. Even if everything went right, the ordeal wasn't over. The couple, red-eyed and likely sleepless, would be expected to emerge together for the community to see. In some courts, breakfast in bed was delivered, not as kindness but as spectacle. Servants carried trays with smirks, nobles exchanged knowing glances, and the couple had to smile through it all, their exhaustion a stage curtain for performance complete. In small villages, the rituals were different but no less invasive. The locals might greet the couple with ribald songs or fertility dances, celebrations with undertones of scrutiny. The question behind every lyric was always the same. Did you do it? And more importantly, did someone see enough to believe it? Because belief was everything. Truth was optional. The most intimate moment of a person's life, reduced to fabric, witnesses, and hearsay. And so the night ended. Not in peace, not in love, but in survival. Let me know when you're ready to continue. We'll pick up from here and continue guiding your audience through the strange, dramatic, and deeply human rituals of the past. Always immersive, always true, and always wrapped in a story worth staying awake to fall asleep to. You wake up the morning after not with a sigh of relief, but with the quiet dread of inspection. The question hangs in the air long before anyone asks it aloud. Did you do it? And more importantly, did you do it right? It doesn't matter if the candles burned low, or if the room was cold and heavy with awkwardness. What matters is what the servants saw, what the priest suspects, and what your mother-in-law is already whispering behind her fan. In a world where gossip traveled faster than horsemen, the wedding night wasn't the end of the celebration. It was the start of scrutiny. And if things didn't go as planned, it wasn't just a disappointing night. It was a social crisis. Because in medieval Europe, a failed bedding ceremony wasn't just a private embarrassment. It was a dynastic earthquake. First came the rumors. The whispers began before the sheets even cooled. If the groom appeared too pale, too flushed, too quiet, questions formed instantly. If the bride's eyes were red, if her hands shook during breakfast, assumptions followed. A groom overcome by wine, fear, or lack of experience might find himself the target of more than mockery. In noble families where marriages sealed political alliances, failure to consummate could lead to full public inquiry. Not metaphorical, literal. Medical experts, midwives, even clergy were summoned to test his capabilities. In France and England, historical records describe trials where noblemen were ordered to prove their manhood before panels of observers. One poor aristocrat underwent physical inspection, cross-examination, and witness testimony, all because his bride reported a silent night. And the bride? If there was no blood, no evidence of virginity, her reputation unraveled before the sun reached its peak. Whether she was pure or not didn't matter. What mattered was the stain, or the lack of it. Some women, desperate to save themselves from shame, resorted to trickery, smuggling in blood from animals, or pricking their own fingers under the sheets. Risky, yes, but sometimes the only way to survive, because the consequences of failure were swift and brutal. An annulment meant disgrace, dowries returned, alliances severed, and for the bride, the label of damaged goods could follow her like a ghost. Nobles might exile her to a convent. Villagers might ridicule her in the town square. In rare and devastating cases, violence followed, beatings, imprisonment, accusations of witchcraft, all for a failed expectation wrapped in linen. Because in this world, the bedding ceremony wasn't just about sealing a marriage. It was about putting two reputations on trial. And when that trial collapsed, it left behind more than rumors. It left scars. Yet, for all its rigid expectations, the bedding ceremony wasn't uniform. Different regions shaped the tradition in wildly different ways. Some merely awkward, others bizarre, some downright cruel. In Scandinavia, for example, tradition demanded the bride be carried, sometimes upside down, into the bridal chamber. A theatrical reminder that she was no longer a maiden, but property in transition. In rural communities, the groom's friends might play pranks, sing embarrassing songs, or lock him out of the room for laughs. Brotherhood had boundaries, but not many. In parts of Germany, things got weirder. The bedding could involve an actual bed on wheels. Yes, a mobile mattress, paraded through the village while neighbors clanged pots and shouted congratulations or jeers. The louder the chaos, the better. It was said to scare off evil spirits, and possibly dignity. Ireland's customs leaned more symbolic. Older women from the village might linger outside the chamber, ready with fertility charms or blunt advice about hips and harvests. In contrast, French royal courts turned the bedding into legal theater. Clergy stood by as the couple signed documents in bed, followed by an exaggerated curtain pull, signaling the show was now underway. And then there was Spain, deeply Catholic, deeply ceremonial. A crucifix hung above the bed. Prayers were recited before any act could begin. This wasn't passion. This was duty, sanctified and sealed by divine supervision. Among peasants, things were looser but still public. Villages might follow the newlyweds to their home with torches, sing teasing songs, or bang on the windows mid-act. Romance? Rare. Communal entertainment? Always. And yet, no matter the setting, castle or cottage, the constant remained. The bedding ceremony wasn't about the couple. It was about the community, the family, the faith, the politics, the proof. Whether done with flourishes or fumbling, with violins or banging pots, the message was the same. We are watching, and we will know. As strange as the rituals were, they reveal the core contradictions of medieval society. The ceremony was sacred and lewd, formal and absurd. It was deadly serious, yet veiled in theater and laughter. Beneath all the customs and cloth, the reality was painfully human, and unspoken truths lingered just behind the curtain. Everyone knew the groom might be terrified. Masculinity may have been prized, but most young men arrived with little experience, zero training, and the crushing pressure of performance. Failure wasn't just personal, it was national, and that, perhaps, was the strangest truth of all. This ceremony, meant to celebrate love and unity, was often a gauntlet of fear, shame, and expectation, where two people who barely knew each other were forced into intimacy under the gaze of everyone they knew. And history simply called it tradition. You're lying in the most watched bed of your life, and suddenly he falters. The groom, red-cheeked and trembling, might not rise to the occasion. Whispers of nerves, too much wine, or even hidden curses pass through clenched teeth outside the door. If he fails, his pride might be spared in public, but behind those heavy curtains, it's a different story. The bride is expected to be quiet, modest, and compliant, but in the privacy of that sacred space, she might weep, plead, or go completely still. These aren't tales shared over breakfast or courtly chatter. These are the whispered truths passed between midwives, mothers, and the older women who gently prepared her for a night no one ever truly prepares for. And then, somehow, there's laughter, because where there's pressure, humor slips in like a release valve. The medieval world, though brutal in many ways, had its mischief. The bedding ceremony became a strange mix of solemn ritual and schoolyard prank. A groom might find his tunic swapped for a woman's gown, a chamber pot tucked under the sheets. In some households, guests tied bells to the bedposts, so no one would have to guess when things had begun. Even clergy occasionally joined in, offering their blessings with a twinkle in their eyes and double meanings in their mouths. "May your union bear fruit in season," they declare, barely suppressing the smirk. Unspoken strategies, too, passed quietly between generations. A nervous groom might arrange a secret practice session with a sex worker, hoping to learn what he couldn't ask. A frightened bride might be handed a bundle of herbs to numb the pain or calm her pulse. Midwives had tricks, gentle distractions, aromatic oils, whispered suggestions. None of it was written. All of it was known, because the bedding ceremony, for all its choreographed pomp, was chaos beneath the lace. It was fear, laughter, secrecy, and performance wrapped into a single night. One bed, one act, one shot to uphold a reputation. And for centuries, this single ritual wasn't just the cornerstone of a marriage. It was the gatekeeper of inheritance, honor, and political stability. Even as time marched on and the Middle Ages softened into the Renaissance, echoes of the bedding ceremony lingered. In the grand courts of Europe, Kings and queens were still tucked into bed by bishops and noble matrons while candles flickered and dignitaries looked on. The act became more symbolic, but the message hadn't changed. In the villages of Eastern Europe, well into the 19th century, tradition still carried its weight. The sheets were checked. The songs were sung. The couple, whether ready or not, still had to perform. Not for each other, but for everyone else. Privacy, it was a luxury, and for many a foreign concept. The church helped preserve this legacy. According to canon law, vows alone weren't enough. Without consummation, a marriage wasn't sealed in the eyes of God. A quiet exchange in a forest grove meant little. A well-documented bedding night, witnessed and confirmed, was divine. What's perhaps most striking isn't how foreign it sounds, but how familiar it still feels. We've come far, but not as far as we like to think. The obsession with purity, the pressure for perfection on the honeymoon, the lingering cultural weight around a couple's first night together. We may not tie bells to the bed anymore, but the ghosts of that ceremony linger in expectation. For the medieval couple, that night became a trial, a test, not of love, but of performance, pressure, and legacy. Some grew closer in the aftermath, bonded by the absurdity, the ordeal, and the whisper of relief. Others carried scars, invisible but heavy, shaped by a ritual that felt more like survival than celebration. And so the bed stood not a sanctuary, but a stage. And history, it never looked away. But just when you think you're finally drifting into a gentler chapter of medieval life, the story shifts once more. Imagine now that your tooth begins to ache. Just a dull throb at first, but in a world without dentists, toothbrushes, or even a word for cavity, that ache means something else entirely. You live in medieval Europe, and your mouth is a battlefield all its own. You wake up in medieval Europe with an ache throbbing behind your molars, and deep down, you already know, this isn't going to end well. The very concept of dental care, as you know it, simply doesn't exist. No toothbrush, no dentist's chair, no fluoride or floss, just your teeth, left to fend for themselves like tiny, doomed soldiers. Your mouth? It's just another cave, and what lurks inside it, that's your burden to bear. Back then, even your diet worked against you. Bread, the staple of every meal, was packed with grit and ground stone, thanks to the mills that carved it into flour. Each bite slowly wore away enamel like sandpaper. Meat was often tough, aged past tenderness, while vegetables were boiled until they surrendered all form. Sugar wasn't the villain yet. It hadn't even entered the scene for most of Europe, but still, decay came knocking early and often. By your 20s, your smile likely resembled a battlefield after a siege. Crooked walls, missing parts, and signs of surrender. A simple cavity didn't get cleaned. It rotted. First a dull throb, then sharp, unrelenting torment. An infected tooth could swell your jaw, cloud your thinking, and in the worst cases, bring death. Yes, death from an infection reaching your bloodstream or brain, though no one understood the why. They'd just call it punishment from the heavens and light a candle to Saint Apollonia, patron of dental agony. In desperate moments, remedies were more superstition than science. A mash of herbs, a rinse of honey and vinegar, maybe even a hot iron held near your cheek to draw out the evil spirits. These weren't cures, they were distractions. Sometimes they helped, most times they didn't. And when the suffering became unbearable, the only solution anyone truly trusted was this. It had to come out. So they'd look you in the eye, your mother, your priest, your village healer, and say the dreaded words. Not repair, not save, pull. Rip it from your mouth and pray what's left behind doesn't kill you. And this is where the real fun began. Because in a world without licensed dentists, the job of removing a tooth was left to those available. Enter the barber surgeon. 1 part hairstylist, 1 part battlefield medic, and 1 part grim improviser. This was the man who might cut your hair, bleed your fever, reset your broken leg, and yank out your aching tooth, all before lunch. He didn't speak Latin or quote medical theory. He learned by watching others and surviving mistakes. Tooth pulling was considered low-level surgery, messy, painful, and far too undignified for the highly educated. That's how barbers ended up as your last hope. Their tools? Iron hooks, twisting pliers, long forceps, all more fitting for a torture chamber than a medical office. Sterilization didn't exist. If you were lucky, the blood was wiped off with a cloth. If not, your instruments still bore the mark of the last victim. Anesthetic? There wasn't any. You might get a leather strap to bite down on, or a gulp of spirits if your barber had any to spare. Some villagers just clenched their teeth, those that remained, and braced for the storm. The procedure was swift if you were fortunate. A single, brutal tug and it was done. But more often, the tooth splintered. And then came the digging, root and all, while you flailed, bled, or passed out. Yet strange as it sounds, some barber surgeons took pride in their gruesome art. Word spread of those with a clean pull. And these men traveled town to town like rock stars of pain relief. In the town square, they'd hammer extracted teeth to wooden signs like hunting trophies, advertising their trade. Did patients complain? Rarely, because a screaming jaw was worse than any man with pliers. Even before disaster struck, medieval folk tried to protect their teeth, with what little they understood. And the centerpiece of that care? Tooth powder. Forget soft bristled brushes and minty paste. This was DIY dentistry with a vengeance. Tooth powder came tucked in ceramic jars or linen pouches. Each batch was a gamble. Recipes passed down by word of mouth, tweaked with desperation. Crushed bones, burned bread, ashes, herbs, and if you really wanted to feel clean, add crushed oyster shell or charcoal. The goal wasn't to kill bacteria, no one knew they existed. The goal was to scrape, scratch, and scour. This wasn't gentle brushing. It was closer to sanding a wooden plank. Powders were applied with cloth, fingers, or if you were wealthy, a twig with bristles carved from hog hair. And though it may have left your breath faintly herbal, it likely did little for the rot hiding deep within your gums. Still, it was something, a ritual, a small act of control in a world where mouths could turn murderous. And so, each morning, villagers would scrub and rinse, not knowing if they were helping or hurting, but trying nonetheless. And perhaps in that act of trying, there was hope, even in a world without dentists. If your mouth carried the scent of rot and ruin, it wasn't just unpleasant. It was a sign. Some might whisper that you were cursed. Others, more cruelly, might call it a national trait, pinning bad breath on your homeland as if decay had a dialect. To mask the stench, people turned to whatever the earth could offer. Mint, sage, rosemary, even salt. Not for hygiene, but for illusion. They weren't cleansing the mouth. They were cloaking the truth. If you were wealthy, you crushed clove, cinnamon, or other rare imports into a fragrant grit. If you were poor, soot and bone dust had to suffice. And then there was honey, golden, comforting, and disastrously misunderstood. Some healers praised it for its soothing, antibacterial properties, and they weren't entirely wrong. But filling a cavity with sugar-sticky honey was like throwing water on an ember and wondering why the fire roared back to life. It dulled the ache briefly, but sped up the rot underneath. Still, it was one of the more reasonable attempts. Other remedies drifted into the absurd. Ground-up mouse skulls. Dog's milk simmered like soup. Even urine rinses found their place in the strange alchemy of medieval healing. Did they work? No. But pain doesn't always ask for logic, it begs for relief. And in desperation, superstition often felt like medicine. That's what medieval oral care was, less about stopping decay and more about surviving it. You didn't dream of white smiles or clean gums. You prayed the rot would wait. And when potions failed, people reached for something older than medicine, magic and faith. Toothaches weren't always blamed on poor habits. In fact, the pain was often seen as a spiritual punishment or the work of invisible enemies. Many believed their agony came from tiny worms nesting in the tooth's center, chewing and writhing with each pulse of pain. Some swore they saw them. Others simply believed the throbbing was the sound of the creatures moving. To expel them, one popular method involved blowing vapor from burning henbane seeds into the mouth, hot, acrid fumes meant to drive the worms out. More likely, they scorched the gums and worsened the misery. Still, this was a world where fire fought demons, and smoke was a weapon of the spirit. If heat failed, you might wear a charm, perhaps a strip of parchment strung around your neck. On it, scribbled Latin verses, star symbols, or lines that looked like nonsense but carried deep faith. These were believed to hold healing energy. And when hope was thin, people turned to the image of Saint Apollonia, a woman said to have had her teeth ripped from her mouth in martyrdom. She became the patron of all who clutched their cheeks and whispered her name in the dark. The church stood in a curious place, one foot in scripture, the other in folk belief. Monasteries served as healing centers where monks offered herb-based remedies paired with prayers. Some medical writings from religious orders advised fasting to purify the soul and confession to rebalance the body. Others recommended you simply attend Mass and beg for mercy. If you had wealth or favor, you might be granted access to a holy relic, a saint's bone, a drop of sacred oil, or a splinter of a cross. Place it near the aching tooth. Wait, hope. You might still die of infection, but at least your soul would be clean. Because when everything else failed, when powders, prayers, and potions gave no peace, the medieval mouth became a battleground between faith and infection. And it was a war without a clear victor. You see, pain in the Middle Ages wasn't something to be soothed. It was something to be endured, like a long winter or a difficult marriage. Anesthetics didn't exist. Numbing creams, sterile tools, or calming music. Unheard of. Pain was part of the ritual, and in some twisted way it was respected. Tooth removal wasn't private. It was a grim ceremony, a trial by endurance. You'd sit in a creaky chair, eyes glassy, jaw swollen. A man in a stained apron approached with iron tools. No gloves, no explanation. Maybe a gulp of ale if you could afford it. Maybe a quiet prayer if you couldn't. Then came the metal, the grip, the twist, the snap. If the tooth shattered, and often it did, he'd dig. Your mouth became a battlefield of blood and splinters. Some passed out. Others vomited. Some bit down so hard they tore their own lips. Relatives held your arms. Children watched. And still people returned. Because the ache of a rotten tooth was worse than anything that man in the apron could do. A few barber surgeons earned reputations as masters of the pull. They worked fast like dueling pistols, one shot, one scream, done. But others were careless. Records tell of jaws broken, gums torn, teeth shattered and roots left behind. There were no guarantees and no second chances. But even in this, there was bravery, a strange, enduring courage. People walked into pain with open eyes, simply because they had no other choice. And perhaps that is where the true story lies. Not in the soot or the bone dust or the charms, but in the quiet resolve of a person willing to face the fire with nothing but grit and hope. You sleep under clean sheets. You brush your teeth with flavored pastes. You step into a clinic where the worst thing is the wait. But imagine for a moment you didn't. Imagine you're in a village where the scent of roasting geese mixes with the iron tang of blood, and a man in a feathered hat stands ready to rip the pain from your jaw, not with mercy, but with spectacle. You see, if your tooth got infected back then, and it often did, you didn't rush to a doctor. You either endured it or faded into silence. Some so-called dentists would line up patient after patient, passing the same unwashed metal from mouth to mouth like a cursed heirloom. Boiling water? Never crossed their mind. Wiping? Not even with a sleeve. One person's bacteria was another's doom, and the word cross-contamination hadn't been coined, let alone understood. And yet, people still lined up. Why? Because the alternative was worse. Pain so sharp, so constant, it turned meals into misery and sleep into torment. Prayer, honey, ground up bones. None of it worked. And when nothing soothed the rot, force was the last tool left. There were no numbing gels, no gentle words, just grit, steel, and a bucket waiting to catch the aftermath. And not all of it happened in dark corners. No, some of the most dreadful screams rang out in the daylight, right in the middle of the town square. Between the sausage seller and the goose merchant, crowds gathered not for healing, but for a show. Enter the traveling tooth puller. These weren't doctors. They were performers in flamboyant costumes, wielding oversized pliers and scrolls covered in unreadable Latin, claiming to be blessed by saints or kings. Some had fake credentials, Others didn't bother pretending. Their method? Attract a crowd, make a scene, and pull until the pain was gone, or until something cracked. They'd start with a speech, loud and proud, promising miraculous cures and velvet-gloved care. A planted assistant might wail in false pain, only to be miraculously healed moments later. Then came the real volunteers, people desperate for relief. One unlucky soul would step forward, and with a twist of iron, the tooth would be ripped out and lifted for all to see like a butcher's prize. Blood thrilled the crowd. Screaming sealed the deal. It meant the man was doing real work. Afterward, these showmen would sell tiny bottles of aftercare, herbal elixirs, wine-soaked cloves, or mysterious powders, all pitched as divine cures. But really, just spices and spirits with a story. Still, the crowd left smiling, the puller left richer, and the patient left lighter, in more ways than one. Some of these men were oddly skilled. Others caused more damage than relief. But they served a grim purpose. In places without a monastery or a surgeon's tent, they were the only hope. Think of them as medieval dentistry's answer to a fast food drive-through. Quick, reckless, unforgettable. So next time you're reclining in a sterile dental chair, listening to soft music while your dentist adjusts a spotless mirror, remember, you could have been in a muddy square, surrounded by chickens, while a stranger in a feathered hat held up your molar to the cheers of strangers. And before you assume that royalty had it any better, don't. A crown on your head didn't mean perfection in your mouth. In fact, noble diets made things worse. While peasants gnawed roots and barley, nobles indulged in sweet meats, spiced wine, dried fruits, and imported sugar. Rare? Yes, but used with reckless delight. Cavities ran wild in the mouths of the elite. Rotten breath, loose teeth, blackened gums, all hidden behind velvet and etiquette. Records whisper tales of monarchs plagued by dental misery. One queen stuffed her mouth with cloves to chase away the stench. A king's teeth grew so loose they rattled. Royal women had to smile with closed lips because opening their mouths might reveal the battlefield inside. And though they had access to barber surgeons, that didn't guarantee comfort. Queen Elizabeth herself avoided treatment so long that infection spread through her jaw. A bishop once had his own tooth pulled in front of her just to prove it wasn't so bad. It didn't help. Fear still won. To mask the truth, nobles painted their teeth with white powders, some made from toxic lead, and chewed perfumed tablets to hide the smell. Their portraits rarely show open smiles. Not because it was dignified, but because it was strategic. Smiling meant revealing. And what lay beneath the lips of royalty was often something best left hidden. So while peasants screamed in muddy squares and merchants stuffed herbs in their mouths, kings and queens suffered in silence. Behind curtains, behind fans, behind the illusion of grace. Now rest easy, knowing your clean toothbrush is a modern miracle. And perhaps, dream of a time when pain was a public ritual, and the line between healer and showman was as thin as a sliver of enamel. You brush your teeth without thinking, maybe humming, maybe scrolling your phone. But you, dear listener, are standing on the bones of history, of strange rituals, whispered myths, and the stubborn will of people who refused to rot quietly. While the dramatic world of tooth pullers and market square extractions stole the spotlight, the quieter routines of medieval oral care played out behind closed doors, in candlelit kitchens, and at the edges of belief. You wouldn't call it brushing, but that doesn't mean they did nothing. People, especially the poor, chewed twigs from trees like juniper, hazel, or marshmallow. They'd fray one end and rub it along their teeth, a kind of makeshift toothbrush that left behind a whisper of flavor. Not exactly a cure for decay, but it was better than letting roasted goose and festival sweets fester between your molars for days. And then there were the rinses. Not minty blue liquid in a designer bottle, but vinegar, or wine, or, in some cases, urine. Yes, urine. The idea was that its warmth and acidity could purge the mouth of dark forces, those mysterious humors that nobody could see, but everyone feared. Monks even recorded recipes, combinations of red wine, boiled sage, and cloves, spiced enough to bite and soothe at the same time. Primitive, yes, but not entirely foolish. Still, the beliefs around teeth went far beyond twigs and vinegar. Some swore that grinding emeralds or pearls into powder and rubbing it on your teeth would keep them white. Others claimed that kissing a donkey could cure a toothache because somehow the pain would transfer to the animal. There were people who packed spider webs into aching gums, hoping the web would trap the pain inside like an unlucky fly. The spider, needless to say, was not consulted. But perhaps the most fascinating obsession wasn't pain. It was breath. You see, in certain circles, bad breath was seen as a sign not just of poor hygiene, but of poor character. A rotting mouth meant a rotting soul. And so, the upper class chewed on cloves, fennel, and anise, especially before stepping into courtrooms, dinner halls, or confessionals. Ironically, many of these same elites gorged on sweets, sugar-coated almonds, dried fruits soaked in syrup, all while trying to mask the decay those very treats invited in. Children were raised with both fear and faith. If a child cried with a toothache, they were sometimes told it was punishment for lying or gluttony. Some were made to pray after eating sweets. Others wore amulets during teething, tiny bones, bits of coral, or metal charms inscribed with holy texts. Was it superstition? Certainly. But it was also love. Desperate, imperfect love trying to ease a child's suffering in a world without answers. By the time the medieval era began to give way to something new, mouths across Europe were, frankly, a disaster. But there were signs of a shift. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. But it was change. Manuscripts began to appear with hand-drawn sketches of teeth, jaws, and even crude dental instruments. Arabic medical texts, like those of the great healers from centuries before, were translated and passed around, bringing new ideas to old problems. Monasteries played their part too. Monks, those quiet record-keepers of humanity, began tracking treatments, herbs, and outcomes. They knew which rinses seemed to help and which patients survived the ordeal. It wasn't glamorous, but it was data, and in that data lay the seeds of real medicine. Barber surgeons, once the jack of all pain trades, began to split into different branches. Some focused more on surgery. A few even dared to specialize in the mouth. The idea of a tooth expert started to flicker into existence. Not respected yet, not trained formally, but recognized as something other than just the guy with the blade and the basin. Cities, too, began to reign in the chaos. Street pullers had to apply for permits or register with the local guild. In some places, they were even banned from setting up near markets, their flamboyant shows replaced by something slightly more civilized. Sanitation, as we call it, was on the rise. Washing your hands in wine before pulling a tooth wasn't exactly sterile, but it was a start. And slowly, something unexpected began to happen. People didn't just fear the pain anymore. They started fearing the look of a bad mouth. Aesthetic concern entered the conversation. A clean, white smile started to hold social value. Among the nobles, perfumed pastes became all the rage. Some made with coral powder, others with rose oil or crushed mint. Portraits, once grim and tight-lipped, began to show faint smiles, a suggestion of teeth, a hint of health. We were still centuries away from fillings and numbing agents, but the journey had begun. The curtain had lifted just enough to see a future beyond pain. So next time you're reclining in a softly lit room, a gentle hum in your ears, and a kind dentist asking you how your weekend went, pause for a moment. Close your eyes. Imagine a dirt path, chickens pecking nearby, a man with wine-soaked hands and rusty pliers leaning toward you under a flickering torch. That was once the standard, and somehow we made it here. From spiderwebs to scalpels, from prayers to anesthesia. Your smile carries the legacy of every crooked tooth, every whispered myth, and every stubborn soul who tried, failed, and tried again. And now, you get to rest, knowing your dreams are safe from the donkey's kiss. You carry your lunch in a fridge. You sip coffee from a machine. But what if your pantry had 4 legs and your next meal kicked up dust with every stride? Welcome to the Mongol steppe, where food wasn't just nourishment. It was survival, strategy, and speed. You see, the endless winds of the open plains didn't care if you were hungry. Winters were icy enough to snap bone. Summers dry enough to parch the soul. There were no kitchens, no ovens tucked in cozy corners. Meals had to move as fast as the warriors who ate them. The Mongol diet wasn't about taste, it was about power. Food had to last, it had to travel, and it had to keep up. At the core of this battlefield cuisine, meat, but not the sizzling, fire-charred kind you might imagine. Mongols dried their meat into thin, leathery strips called borts. Long slivers of goat, sheep, or horse, left out in the open wind until it shrank into near nothing. It weighed little, spoiled slower than time, and could be boiled into a hot broth right in the middle of nowhere. Think of it as jerky's older, rougher cousin. No spice, no sugar, just raw survival pressed into every bite. And horses? They weren't just for riding. A wounded steed wasn't mourned, it was honored at the table. Horse meat, with its warming energy, was prized in the chill of the plains. Even more, the horse itself was a mobile pantry. While the rider carried borts in saddlebags, the living animal provided milk, fresh, vital, and transformative. That milk became arag, a fizzy, sour drink that rode the line between beverage and ritual. Made from mare's milk and stirred relentlessly in leather sacks hung from yurts or saddles, it fermented within a day or two. Children were even tasked with kicking the bags as they passed, turning play into process. The result? A cloudy, slightly alcoholic drink with a wild tang and a deeper meaning. Arag wasn't just liquid, it was identity in a bowl. It was how you welcomed guests, how you sealed peace, how you remembered home. There were no glass bottles, no refined brewing systems, just intuition and leather. The nomads didn't need vineyards. They needed movement, and Arag moved with them, cooled in summer. It warmed in winter. It gave the mind clarity when thoughts clouded, and its absence at a feast was unthinkable. To turn it down was an insult. To accept it was a bond. Foreign travelers often recoiled at its taste, likening it to sour yogurt left in smoke, but for the Mongol it was sacred. There were stronger versions, too. Leave the arag to age and you'd get arhai, a distilled spirit not meant for the timid. It burned, it clarified, and it healed, at least in stories whispered around fires. These drinks weren't background. They were bridges between people, moments, and memory. Now, grains and vegetables? Those were luxuries. The Mongol steppe wasn't fertile ground. Farming was for the settled. These were herders, nomads, masters of motion. Instead of bread, they relied on animal products, cheese, yogurt, fat. When things got desperate, they could even draw blood from a horse with a precise cut. Drink just enough to stay alive, and seal the wound to keep the animal walking. That bond between man and beast wasn't sentimental. It was mutual survival. Everything was portable. Even the dumplings, made from rendered fat, flour, and bits of dried cheese, they were dense little packages of fuel. No frills, no garnish, just sustenance molded into a shape that could survive 100 miles in a saddlebag. Picture it. A warrior galloping across the plains with his dinner under his saddle, softening with the heat of the ride. When hunger struck, he didn't need a fire. He needed water. A quick boil, a handful of borts, and the soup of survival was served. And this diet, this simple, rugged, unrelenting fare powered one of the greatest conquests in human history. No dining halls, no mess tents, just grit, leather, and a handful of fat-drenched calories. So next time you unseal a snack, or click the button on a microwave, imagine the saddle shifting beneath you, the wind howling across the open plain, and the sour bite of arag hitting your tongue. That's what fueled the rise of an empire. Not gold, not spice, but meat, milk, and the will to move. Rest now, knowing that even in the harshest landscapes, ingenuity finds a way. And the body, just like the spirit, adapts, one bite at a time. You've likely never thought of food as a weapon. But if you were galloping through frostbitten grasslands or launching an ambush in a downpour, your next bite had to do more than taste good. It had to keep you alive. You weren't dining. You were refueling mid-charge, sleeve-stuffed with grease-packed dumplings dense enough to knock out hunger for days. These weren't treats. These were survival grenades. High-calorie, oily, compact morsels, tailored to fit the warrior's pace. No melting, no crumbling. You could tuck one into your tunic and forget it was there until your ribs reminded you. And when cold winds clawed at your bones, the broth from boiled animal bones, rich, steaming, oily, was more than comfort. It was insulation. Heated over open flames or warmed with red-hot stones dropped into water, it became the warrior's shield against winter's bite. You didn't need a kitchen to make it work. Just water, heat, and the willingness to keep moving. Mongol riders sometimes filled a flask with dried meat and water at sunrise. By dusk, after a day of travel and skirmish, they'd uncork a ready-made stew without ever lighting a fire. It wasn't elegant, but it kept the empire alive. In moments of desperation, even blood was a resource. A shallow vein in a horse's neck, a few gulps of warmth, then sealing the wound. The horse lived, the rider lived, and they kept riding. No spices, no sauces, just function, brutal, minimalist function. But when the raiding slowed and the warriors returned to their families, food took on a gentler shape. The steppe, so wild and unyielding, gave way to the circular calm of the yurt. The jar inside these felt-wrapped homes, a fire crackled at the center like the pulse of a living heart. The door always faced the sun's path in the south, and above the flame, meals came together with the same simplicity that defined the people. There were no printed recipes, no spice racks. Cooking was survival by instinct. A metal tripod, a heavy pot, some dried dung or firewood, and the ancient wisdom of Mongol women. Boiling was the primary method. Meat was cut into thick, satisfying chunks. Fat, always fat, was added with abandon. The broth bubbled, carrying with it the essence of everything that kept them strong. Salt was a luxury used as sparingly as gold. Most meals were seasoned only with time, temperature, and necessity. One especially beloved dish told its own wild story. A whole animal, often a goat or marmot, was gutted, deboned, and then packed with scorching stones straight from the fire. The skin was tied shut, turning the creature into its own oven. Smoke, fat, and muscle mingled in a slow internal roast. It wasn't clean or easy, but it was unforgettable. Milk was no less valuable. In colder seasons, it was turned into curds, yogurt, or dried into rock-hard cheese discs. These were known to crack a tooth or two, but they lasted through journeys and fed hungry children gnawing away like they were chewing candy. Mealtimes were communal. Circle around the pot, sit on the floor, and eat with your hands. Broth was sipped straight from the bowl. Knives were wiped on sleeves. Dogs got the scraps. Nothing wasted, everything earned. And in this humble domestic chaos, the soul of the Mongol world quietly pulsed. The hearth, though small, was sacred. A place where roaming spirits anchored themselves for the night. A space where food was not just eaten but shared. And through this, life on the move momentarily paused. Yet in the shadow of the commoner's fire, another world simmered. One where power and food danced beneath silk canopies. At the court of the Khans, the same riders who once dined on bone broth and borts transformed into connoisseurs of empire-spanning cuisine. By the time the Mongol Empire reached its golden stretch, from Hungary to Korea, the kitchen was no longer just practical. It was political. Culinary theater bloomed beneath palace roofs. Cooks were summoned from the four corners of the known world: Persians, Chinese, Indians, each bringing their spices, their secrets, their skill. And the table became a stage. There were roasted lambs carved in grand ritual, birds turned slowly over flame until skin crisped and crackled, dumplings folded by the delicate hands of Chinese chefs, stews perfumed with Persian dates, nuts, and the subtle glow of saffron. Flatbreads from foreign lands appeared beside rice soaked in broth. Occasionally, even Indian spice, fennel, cumin, pepper, slipped in, brought by merchants trailing the Silk Road like wandering veins of flavor.